When the lone rancher lifted the burlap sack from his bride's head, he expected hardship, not a beauty that could thaw the ice that had long encased his soul. The wind shrieked down from the granite spires, sharp and brittle, carrying slivers of ice that pierced the worn fabric of Ada Finch's coat. She stood in the line of women, positioned in the muddy enclosure behind Quentin Sneed's trading post, her hands wrung anxiously before her. The air was thick with the scent of livestock, wood smoke, and damp wool. Every woman present had been brought here for a singular purpose, to be purchased or chosen. This was not a fate Ada had chosen for herself. She had been dispatched here after her uncle, weary of providing for a girl with no dowry and even less social grace, had signed her name to the mail-order bride registry. Her photograph had been returned more than once. Finally, after a long silence, a terse note arrived from Quentin Sneed. "A man is willing to take you. Come now before he reconsiders." And so she had come, her face concealed, her heart aflutter with fear, her head bowed beneath a rough burlap sack that kept the world at bay and her shame contained. Inside the trading post, voices rumbled, boots scuffed against the floorboards, and men bartered for flour, ammunition, and chewing tobacco. One voice, however, rose distinctly above the others. It was deep, steady, and deliberate. Gideon Stone. The lone rancher had ridden down from his cabin nestled high in the pines that morning, his heavy coat lined with fur and his hat brim still holding the morning's snow. Frost streaked his dark beard, and his eyes were of a kind that seemed to perceive things others missed, peering through distance, silence, and all manner of pretense. He had not intended to stop for the auction. His purpose in town was to acquire salt, lamp oil, and perhaps a small bag of sugar for his homestead. But upon stepping inside and seeing Quentin Sneed's self-satisfied smirk as he gestured toward a row of trembling women, something tightened in Gideon's chest. Fresh arrivals from back east, Sneed drawled with a dismissive wave. Girls who came looking for riches or romance. Now all they want is a roof over their heads. Gideon remained silent, his gaze sweeping over the women. Most averted their eyes, but one did not. One stood with her hands clenched, her face entirely hidden by a coarse sack tied beneath her chin. "That one's not for display," Sneed snorted when he noticed Gideon's focus. "A face that'd spook a horse." "You don't want her?" A crease formed on Gideon's brow. "Then why is she here? Her family sent her?" "Claimed she consumes more than she contributes," Sneed said with a harsh laugh, leaning in conspiratorially. "But they say she can work. A strong back and a quiet mouth. Might suit a man who doesn't mind what's under the sack." The word struck Ada like a physical blow, but she held herself perfectly still. Gideon's voice was low and resonant. "And what becomes of her if no one chooses her?" Quentin shrugged. "She gets sent back east or put to work in the kitchens here. Either way, she's no longer my concern." A heavy silence descended, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the scream of the wind. Then, Gideon asked softly, "How much?" Sneed blinked, surprised. "You're serious?" Gideon placed a small leather pouch on the counter. The clink of silver coins was sharp and final. "That should cover it." Ada could scarcely comprehend the events unfolding until Quentin Sneed seized her arm and thrust her forward. "Go with your husband, my dear. You've been purchased." Her knees felt weak. She tried to form words, but her throat was parched with fear. Gideon stepped closer, the thick wool of his coat brushing against hers, the warmth of his presence a startling contrast to the biting cold. "Can you ride?" he asked. She managed a single nod from beneath the sack. "Then let's go," he said plainly. "A storm is closing in." They rode in silence for hours. The sky deepened to a bruised purple, and the snow began to fall in earnest, blanketing the world in a white, soundless hush. Ada's fingers ached from her tight grip on the reins. She had no idea where they were headed, only that she was leaving behind every piece of her known life to follow a stranger who had bought her without a single glance at her face. Gideon finally reined his horse to a stop beside a narrow, half-frozen river that snaked through the timber. A small cabin stood in a nearby clearing, a faint curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. He dismounted, secured the horses, and then reached up to help her down. His hand was calloused but steady, the hand of a man who had built his own world. "Inside," he said gently. "You'll freeze to death out here." She stepped into the cabin. It was a single room with a cast-iron stove, a simple table, a bed in one corner, and a cradle that she was not expecting to see. The air smelled of pine and baking bread. "You have a child?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper beneath the sack. "A boy," Gideon confirmed, hanging his coat on a wooden peg. "He's with Mrs. Gable in town until the weather breaks." "He's been unwell." There was a weariness in his tone, a protective edge that made her own chest ache. He turned to face her then, his expression impossible to decipher. "You can take that thing off now if you like." Her hands faltered at the knot behind her head. You don't wish to wait until morning?" He shook his head slowly. "You're here now." A man ought to see the face of the woman under his roof. For a long moment, she stood motionless, her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath shallow. Then, with trembling fingers, she untied the string. The burlap slipped from her head, falling to the floor like the final barrier between her and this new reality. Gideon looked at her. He did not recoil, he did not frown, he did not utter a word. His gaze softened, and he drew a single, sharp breath, as if the wind itself had been knocked from him. Ada's face, fair with a sprinkle of freckles, was a map of delicate lines and quiet strength, framed by hair the color of rich mahogany. Her eyes, a stormy grey blue, were filled with weariness and uncertainty, but they were profoundly alive. She lowered her gaze, bracing for the inevitable scorn or disappointment. Instead, Gideon said quietly, "Sneed said you were a good cook." She blinked, startled by the simple, practical question. "Yes, sir." "I can cook," he nodded, as though this was the only thing that mattered. "Then let's begin there. You can make supper. I'll tend to the fire," and that was all. No derision, no judgment. For the first time in years, someone truly saw her. Not the girl hidden beneath a sack, not the unwanted niece or the spurned bride, but a person with hands that could create warmth in a cold, lonely place. Outside, the wind howled its fury over the mountains. But inside the cabin, for the first time in a very long time, Ada felt a stirring of something she had long forgotten: hope. The snow fell with a vengeance that night. It hammered against the cabin roof like thrown gravel and whistled through the gaps in the window frame. Gideon added another log to the stove, its orange glow painting flickering shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Ada sat at the table, quietly peeling potatoes with a small, sharp knife he had given her. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the pop and hiss of the fire and the soft, rhythmic scrape of the blade against potato skin. Gideon moved with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to solitude, while Ada moved with the careful precision of someone terrified of shattering it. When the stew was finally simmering, its aroma filled the small cabin. Onions, carrots, salt, and something savory and warm she hadn't smelled in months. Home. She stirred the pot, worrying her lower lip. He purchased me, she thought, yet he has made no demands. Gideon approached quietly, standing beside her. He glanced into the pot and gave a single, appreciative nod. "Smells like something a man could live for," he said, his voice a low rumble. Ada offered a faint smile. "Or just something to keep him alive." He let out a soft grunt that might have been a laugh. When they sat to eat, she saw him bow his head for a silent moment before picking up his spoon. She did the same, whispering a prayer she hadn't voiced since her mother had passed. The meal was eaten in silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable, heavy silence. It felt more like a quilt, homespun and warm, offering a sense of security. After dinner, Gideon rose and went to the door, opening it just a crack. The wind tore at his coat. "The storm's worsening," he announced. "We'll be snowed in for a few days, maybe a week." "You'll be snowed in too," Ada said softly. He looked back at her, the corners of his mouth twitching into something resembling a smile. "Suppose we'll both have to make the best of it then." That night, he prepared a bed for her on the floor near the fire, taking his own blanket to the far corner by the door. "I'm a light sleeper," he told her. "If you hear anything, wind, wolves, anything at all, "Don't hesitate to wake me," but Ada didn't hear any wolves. She heard the slow, steady rhythm of Gideon's breathing from across the room, and for the first time in a long time, she did not feel entirely alone. The next morning, the storm had transformed the world into a landscape of pristine white. The door was frozen shut, and Gideon had to use his shoulder to force it open, letting in a blast of frigid air. Ada gasped at the sight. The trees were bowed low under the immense weight of the snow, and the world was silent and vast. "Ever seen snow like this?" he asked, brushing ice crystals from his beard. "Not like this," she whispered. "Back home, it never lasted. Here, it feels like it owns the land." He nodded in agreement. "It does. You don't fight the mountain. You learn to live with it." She watched him as he moved through his morning chores with a quiet purpose. He split firewood, checked the traps he had set near the tree line, and returned with a rabbit and a small sack of cornmeal. His hands were rough and his words were few, but there was a tangible care in everything he did. While he was outside, Ada cleaned the table and decided to bake bread with the flour she found in a tin. The dough was sticky on her fingers, but she found herself humming softly, a melody her mother used to sing. When Gideon returned, the scent of warm bread greeted him at the door. He stopped, a look of surprise on his face. "You baked?" She smiled shyly. "I hope you don't mind." "I thought it might be a welcome comfort." He removed his gloves and walked closer, his eyes on the small loaf cooling on a wooden board. "Mind?" His voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "It feels like a blessing." That one word, blessing, seemed to linger in the air long after the scent of the bread had faded. As the days passed, their life settled into a steady, comfortable rhythm. Ada cooked, mended his clothes, and kept the fire roaring. Gideon hunted, chopped wood, and began to share stories about life in the mountains, how the weather could turn without warning, how silence could be either a friend or an enemy, and how the river was always the last thing to thaw in the spring. Sometimes, he spoke of his son, Samuel. "He's 6 years old," he said one night, sitting by the fire with a tin cup of coffee. "His ma passed away 2 winters ago. A fever took her quick." After she was gone, he didn't speak for a long time. Ada watched the flickering flames, her heart aching for this man and his son. "Does he look like her?" Gideon smiled faintly. "Too much. Her memory lives in his smile." "It's hard, but it's good, too." A comfortable silence settled between them. Ada hesitated, then said, "He's lucky, you know. To have a father who can still see the good in things." Gideon looked up, his gaze meeting hers. "And you? Do you see any good left in your story, Ada?" She swallowed hard. "I'm not certain. The good parts seem to come and go, like sunlight through the clouds." He nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe they're still there. Maybe they're just hiding." By the 5th day, the storm had finally broken. A pale sun shone over the snow-covered landscape, turning the frozen world into a sea of blindingly white glass. Gideon saddled his horse, preparing to ride to town and check on Samuel. "I'll be back by nightfall," he told her. "There's jerky, tea, and flour if you need anything. Keep the fire high." She nodded, though a tightness formed in her chest. It was startling how quickly she had become accustomed to his presence, his quiet voice, and his steady hands. He paused at the door, his eyes lingering on her for a moment. "You've done good work here, Ada," he said softly. "You've made this place feel alive again." Before she could formulate a reply, he was gone, the sound of his horse's hooves crunching in the snow fading until only silence remained. Ada spent the day tidying the cabin, humming again, though the tune was more fragile now. She discovered an old, worn book on a shelf, its pages soft with use. She read until the daylight faded, her attention caught by a small, yellow, pressed flower tucked between 2 pages. When she heard the sound of hooves that evening, she leaped to her feet, her heart pounding. The door swung open. Gideon stepped inside, snow dusting his shoulders, a small boy clinging tightly to his coat. "This here is Samuel," Gideon said gently. The boy peeked out from behind his father's leg. He was pale and thin, with weary eyes. Ada knelt down slowly, offering him a kind smile. "Hello, Samuel." "I'm Ada." The boy remained silent, but after a moment of consideration, he reached out a small hand and touched hers, a quiet gesture of nascent trust. And Gideon, he just stood there, watching the two of them, his eyes glimmering with an emotion deeper than simple relief. For the first time in a very long time, his cabin didn't just contain walls and warmth. It held the promise of a home. And the woman who had entered his life wearing a sack on her head had brought that promise with her. By the third week, the mountain had begun to thaw. The ice on the cabin eaves dripped with a steady rhythm, and the river below Gideon's property had started to murmur again, a whispered promise of spring. For Ada, each morning had become a ritual of quiet contentment. She would build the fire, prepare breakfast, and then help little Samuel with small chores. The boy had started following her around like a small shadow, though his words were still few. He would point at things, tug on her sleeve, and sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, he would smile. Gideon noticed. One morning, he was leaning against the door frame as she showed Samuel how to knead dough. The boy's small hands made uneven divots in the floury mass. Ada guided him gently, her laughter as soft as the wind in the pines. "Not so hard, little one," she said. "You have to let it breathe." Samuel looked from her face up to his father's. A flicker of something crossed his expression, a question, perhaps, or the beginning of trust. When Ada turned, she found Gideon watching her, his gaze unreadable. "What is it?" she asked, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. He shook his head slightly. It's been a long time since I've heard laughter in this house." Ada smiled faintly, her eyes dropping to the dough. "Maybe your home was just waiting for someone to remember how." Gideon didn't respond immediately. He crossed the room, placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder, and said quietly, "Maybe you're right." As the snow melted, the trails became passable again. Gideon started making weekly trips into town for supplies, and sometimes Ada would accompany him. The first time she set foot back in that town since the day she was sold, every stair felt like a stone thrown at her. Whispers trailed them from the general store porch, from the blacksmith's forge, and from the women gathered at the town pump. "That's the one with the sack," someone murmured. "The rancher's purchase," another snickered. Ada kept her chin high, but a knot of anxiety twisted in her stomach. Gideon noticed. As they were returning to the wagon, he stopped before climbing up. "You carry yourself with more grace than anyone I know, Ada," he said. She shrugged, forcing a smile. "If I let them see me crumble, they win." Gideon gave a short, appreciative nod. "You have a spine of steel," Ada finched. They rode back to the cabin in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't demand to be filled. A week later, the first wildflowers began to push their way through the melting snow. Samuel proudly presented her with one, a delicate blue lupine. He handed it to her without a word, and she tucked it behind her ear. "Thank you, Samuel," she whispered. "It's beautiful." Gideon, watching from the porch, allowed a small, fleeting smile. There was a change in the way he looked at her now. The pity and curiosity were gone, replaced by something quieter and much deeper. That evening, as the sky burned with orange and gold over the ridge, Gideon spoke while sharpening his knife by the fire. "I used to believe beauty was a curse out here," he said, his voice thoughtful. "It invites trouble, makes a man reckless." He paused, the blade of the knife catching the firelight. "I think I was wrong." Ada turned from the stew she was stirring. "What changed your mind?" He looked up slowly, his gaze meeting hers directly. "You." The single word hung in the air between them, gentle yet heavy with meaning. Ada froze, unsure of what to say, unsure if she could speak at all. Gideon didn't press her for a response. He returned to sharpening his knife, though his eyes remained on her for a moment longer than necessary. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling rafters, her heart thudding in her chest. "He can't mean it," she thought. "Not me." But when she closed her eyes, she could still see the look on his face, a look not of hunger or desire, but of quiet, profound recognition. As if he was finally seeing her exactly as she was meant to be seen. Spring arrived in a rush of vibrant life, bringing with it melting creeks, meadows of flowers, and the rich scent of damp pine. Gideon had started taking Samuel to the river to learn how to fish, and Ada would often pack them bread and dried fruit for their excursions. When they returned, she would hear laughter long before they came into view, Samuel's voice, light and free, calling out, "Mama, look." The first time he said it, she froze mid-stride. Gideon looked just as startled, his eyes darting to her face. Samuel, oblivious, held up a small, glistening fish, a wide grin on his face. "Mama, I caught it all by myself." Ada's vision blurred. She dropped to her knees, her arms open, and he ran straight into her embrace. "Oh, Samuel," she whispered, holding him tightly. "You did so well." Gideon stood watching them, his expression unreadable but his eyes soft. "Seems he's got two things to thank the Lord for now," he murmured. That night, the cabin was once again filled with laughter. For the first time, Ada sang, a soft melody from her childhood. Gideon leaned in the doorway, listening quietly as Samuel clapped along. It felt right, as if the world outside had paused its turning, content to simply listen. A few days later, Gideon hitched the wagon. "You'll come to town, too," he said, not as a question but as a statement. "Samuel's been asking to get a ribbon for your hair." Ada laughed, a blush rising in her cheeks. "He has he?" "He says blue suits you," Gideon replied. "I'd say he has good taste." When they arrived in town, people stared as they always did, but something had shifted. This time, Ada did not lower her gaze. She walked beside Gideon, calm and steady, radiant in her simple dress. They passed Mrs. Hemlock, the woman who had once declared she'd never be chosen. The older woman stopped, her eyes wide as she took in the scene, Ada with her head held high, and Gideon's hand resting gently on the small of her back as they navigated the crowd. Later that afternoon, while Gideon was loading supplies, a young girl approached Ada outside the store. She said shyly, "My ma says you're the woman who made the Lone Rancher smile again." Ada blinked, taken aback. Then a soft smile touched her lips. "Well," she said, "maybe the mountain just needed a little warmth." Gideon overheard. As he climbed onto the wagon beside her, his voice was low. "She's right, you know. I haven't smiled like this in years." Ada turned to him, meeting his gaze as the sun caught the gold flecks in his beard. "You're a good man, Gideon," she said quietly. "You just needed someone to remind you." He nodded once, the corner of his mouth lifting. "And you, Ada, you needed someone to see what was already there." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and rich earth, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. There were no vows exchanged, no grand declarations, just two souls, as steady as the mountains that surrounded them, quietly beginning to belong to one another.